Today, you've chosen to speak out for the first time. Why have you decided?
Winter had descended upon the Swiss Alps with its customary silence, blanketing the village of Verbier in an almost surreal stillness. Chalets, owned by billionaires and titans of industry, sat scattered across the slopes like jewels. But one property had become infamous, a symbol of whispered scandals and quiet controversies. This was the holiday villa of Prince Andrew, Duke of York. For years, this £13 million refuge had shielded the Duke from the relentless glare of British tabloids and the murmurs echoing through palace corridors. But in February 2023, what seemed like a routine property inspection would ignite revelations stretching far beyond the snow-covered peaks, threatening secrets long buried in shadow. The discovery didn't come from investigators, journalists, or palace insiders. It came from an unexpected quarter. Marie-Claire Dubois, a local property manager tasked with overseeing maintenance during the Duke's extended absence, noticed something off during what should have been a simple walkthrough. The villa had sat empty for 18 months, a highly unusual stretch even by the standards of a prince accustomed to disappearing from public view after that disastrous Newsnight interview and his settlement with Virginia Giuffre. Andrew had not returned to his alpine sanctuary. The villa lay silent, accumulating dust and mounting questions. Dubois entered through the service entrance on that chilly February morning, her breath forming small clouds in the unheated interior. The villa sprawled over 6 floors, each more ostentatious than the last. Persian rugs stretched across polished marble. Chandeliers imported from Venetian artisans hung dormant above the dining tables, and paintings, some bearing names that made Dubois' hands twitch for her phone, lined the walls in elaborate frames. Yet it wasn't the obvious displays of wealth that drew her attention. It was a locked door, tucked away on the 3rd floor, deep in a quiet corridor. She had never been asked to clean it. Experienced property managers develop instincts about spaces. They read the architecture of secrets. This door, unremarkable at first glance, had a lock far more complex than those guarding rooms full of crystal, art, and priceless antiques. Dubois had instructions to inspect and document, but the door presented a problem. It appeared on no official floor plan. According to the blueprints filed with local authorities, this section of the 3rd floor simply shouldn't exist. Concerned, she reached out to the Duke's London legal team, a Mayfair firm with aristocrats on its letterhead and a reputation for handling sensitive matters. The conversation, she would later recall, felt oddly scripted. "Leave the door alone," she was told. "It contains personal items, family heirlooms, correspondence. Nothing of real consequence." But lawyers don't usually get nervous over heirlooms. Anxiety of that sort carries a different, far darker frequency. Dubois recognized it immediately, having managed estates for clients who had secrets worth hiding. What happened next remains disputed. Some say she contacted Swiss authorities out of concern over insurance liability. Others whisper of a tabloid incentive, a payout that could secure a comfortable retirement. The truth likely sits somewhere in the grey space between duty and opportunity, regardless of motive. Within 72 hours, the villa was swarmed by Swiss police, lawyers, and a locksmith specialising in ultra-secure locks. The door finally yielded, revealing a room that shouldn't have existed, around 20 square metres, windowless, climate-controlled like a museum. The air smelled of leather and aged paper, the scent of meticulously preserved secrets. What they found inside would shake Buckingham Palace and expose questions the royal family had desperately hoped would remain buried forever. 7 filing cabinets lined the walls, each perfectly organised. They held documents spanning 30 years, financial records winding through offshore accounts, correspondence with names often tied to international arms deals, and photographs, some innocent, others deeply compromising, carefully arranged with dates and locations meticulously noted. Perhaps most explosive were the documents resembling insurance files, records that documented the Duke's relationship with Jeffrey Epstein far beyond what had been publicly acknowledged, including flight logs that didn't match official statements, payments routed through intermediaries, communications revealing a friendship not of convenience but of mutual benefit, the kind that even hardened investigators found unnerving. Andrew had always insisted his connection with Epstein was a mistake of judgment. These documents told a far darker, more complex story. Yet the Epstein materials were only part of the revelation. The cabinets also detailed his business dealings and a web of connections cultivated over decades as Britain's special representative for trade and investment. Dictators, oligarchs, and shadowy operators appeared alongside records of payments, favours exchanged, and carefully maintained correspondence. The line between royal duty and personal enrichment had vanished completely. Here lay proof of a parallel life lived in the shadows of diplomatic privilege, where a prince could broker deals capable of destroying lives with a signature. Swiss authorities, aware of the diplomatic sensitivities, proceeded cautiously. Documents were photographed, catalogued, and then, in a decision later scrutinised heavily, the British Embassy in Bern was contacted. What happened in the hours that followed remains partly sealed behind diplomatic protocols and national security measures. Still, the outlines are clear. The royal family faced a crisis threatening not just one individual, but the very institution itself. The news of the discovery reached Buckingham Palace through encrypted channels, first to the private secretary, and then carefully phrased to King Charles himself. Barely 6 months into his reign, following Queen Elizabeth II's death, Charles faced a dilemma. His mother had spent her final years quietly managing palace affairs. Andrew had been a problem for decades, a constant source of anxiety for officials skilled in handling scandals. But this was different. This was tangible evidence, meticulously preserved, of actions that could not be explained away with vague claims of poor judgment. A private meeting convened in one of the palace offices, away from the tourists and photographers in the state rooms. Present were the king's private secretary, the master of the household, and legal counsel, experts in constitutional law and crisis management. Also on a secure video link was Sir Edward Llewellyn, a former diplomat with experience navigating sensitive international affairs. Charles, sources say, listened in silence as the situation unfolded. His brother had maintained insurance files, a personal contingency in case the family moved to distance themselves permanently. The implications were chilling and deeply personal. Andrew had not just engaged in questionable behaviour, he had documented it, a betrayal cutting deeper than tabloid scandals or disastrous interviews, signalling a man who trusted no one, not even his own family. The legal assessment was clear. Public disclosure would be catastrophic. Criminal investigations could erupt worldwide. Beyond Andrew's personal liability, the files threatened to expose decades of royal tolerance for actions that should have triggered intervention long ago. Years earlier, the palace had known, or should have known, about aspects of the Duke's life that were now documented in meticulous detail. Their inaction would face merciless scrutiny. Options were grim. Claim diplomatic immunity and spark outrage, cooperate fully and face relentless media exposure, or attempt containment through negotiation and subtle diplomatic pressure in the grey zones of international law. King Charles made his choice. No cover-up, he declared, but no reckless exposure either. The palace would cooperate with legitimate legal inquiries while safeguarding information genuinely sensitive to national security. It was a middle path satisfying no one, yet preventing potentially catastrophic fallout. More significantly, the king made clear that his brother's time as a working royal was over permanently. No rehabilitation, no gradual return to public duties. Prince Andrew was in effect excommunicated from the only life he had ever known. But the king's decision addressed only the official response. Privately, the royal family was fracturing. Prince William, already wary of his uncle's influence and fiercely protective of the monarchy's reputation, argued for full transparency. He insisted that the truth emerge and the consequences be faced head-on, better. The royal family faced a painful reckoning, harsher than years of drip-fed revelations. Princess Anne, the king's sister, took it hardest. She had never hidden her contempt for Andrew's behaviour, and this discovery confirmed everything she had long suspected. Her position was stark: remove him from the family entirely, strip him of titles and allowances, and let him face justice without the shield of royal protection. Queen Consort Camilla watched these private family deliberations with the careful neutrality of someone seasoned in public perception and palace politics. She understood that the monarchy's survival depended not on shielding its members, but on proving that no one, royal or otherwise, stood above accountability. Yet she also recognized the human dimension. This was her husband's brother, a family tie complicated by childhood memories and shared experiences that did not vanish simply because scandal now tainted the name. Prince Andrew remained at Royal Lodge, the 30-room mansion in Windsor Great Park that he had fought so hard to retain. When informed of the discovery, his reaction oscillated wildly between defiance and panic. He insisted that the documents were being misinterpreted, that context was being ignored, but his arguments persuaded no one. The files were too precise, too meticulously maintained to be dismissed as innocent record-keeping. They spoke of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and had prepared for the day it would all come to light. Conversations between Charles and Andrew during this period, conducted away from staff and recording devices, would remain private. But those who observed the brothers afterward described a relationship shattered beyond repair. Charles had spent years defending Andrew, absorbing criticism from advisors who had long insisted that the Duke should have been removed from royal duties decades earlier. Now the evidence of his brother's duplicity sat in a locked room in Switzerland, a monument to misplaced loyalty and hidden ambition. When the palace issued its official statement, it was a masterclass in controlled language. It acknowledged that certain materials had been discovered during a routine property inspection, confirmed that the Duke was cooperating fully with appropriate authorities, and expressed the family's commitment to transparency while respecting ongoing legal processes. What the statement did not convey were the sleepless nights, the furious arguments, and the grim realization that the monarchy had come within a hair's breadth of catastrophic damage. Behind the calm phrasing lay a frantic scramble to understand the full scope of the problem. Forensic accountants traced financial transactions. Intelligence services assessed potential national security implications. Lawyers began delicate negotiations with Swiss authorities, trying to control the release of information while the palace operated in full crisis mode, a mode it had entered with increasing frequency as scandals had mounted in recent years. Details of the villa's contents began to emerge as spring arrived in London. Carefully managed leaks and court filings slowly painted a portrait of Prince Andrew that diverged sharply from the public image he had cultivated. The Duke, once seen as a somewhat buffoonish figure whose sins were vanity and poor judgment, now appeared calculating and deliberate. The financial documents proved particularly damning. They revealed a network of offshore accounts and trusts in places like the British Virgin Islands and Panama, with transactions designed to obscure the source and destination of funds. Between 1995 and 2018, approximately £12 million flowed through these accounts, money whose origins remain murky. Some funds appeared linked to his work as a trade envoy from 2001 to 2011, a decade when Andrew travelled the globe promoting British business interests and meeting government and corporate leaders. His role had been controversial from the start, with critics questioning whether a royal should be involved in commercial activities. Now the files suggested he used that position for personal enrichment, accepting payments from individuals and companies who benefited from his royal connections. One file detailed a relationship with Timur Kalev, a Kazakh oligarch and son-in-law of the nation's former dictator. The Duke had facilitated business deals benefiting Kalev's interests in Britain, including the controversial sale of Andrew's former marital home for £3 million above asking price. Correspondence made clear this was not a simple property transaction, it was a pattern of mutual benefit. Andrew provided access and influence. Kalev provided money, routed through mechanisms preserving plausible deniability. Another set of documents detailed his involvement with Jeffrey Epstein, the American financier whose crimes shocked the world. Andrew had long claimed he was unaware of Epstein's criminal activities, insisting their friendship was social rather than substantive. The files told a different story: undisclosed flights, visits to properties where abuse had occurred, and communications suggesting far deeper involvement than he had ever admitted. Most damning were the photographs, not the infamous image with Virginia Giuffre, which had been dismissed as possibly doctored, but dozens of others. Over many years, Andrew appeared relaxed, comfortable, fully embedded in Epstein's world, contradicting his later claims of casual acquaintance. Images from Epstein's Caribbean island and New York mansion revealed parties with powerful men and young women whose presence raised obvious questions. Perhaps most disturbing were Andrew's own notes interspersed among financial records and photographs, handwritten and typed commentaries that read like a diary of grievance. They revealed a man consumed by resentment, convinced he was underappreciated and unfairly criticized. Bitter observations targeted other family members, accusing them of failing to support him, hinting at jealousy over his supposed success and popularity. These notes also showed a man aware that his actions might eventually face scrutiny. Andrew had kept these files not as nostalgia, but as leverage, an insurance policy against the day the family might move against him. In one chilling entry from 2019, shortly after the Epstein scandal erupted again, he wrote that he had taken deliberate steps to protect himself. If the palace attempted to sacrifice him, they would find he was far from defenseless. This revelation reframed the narrative. The royal family was not dealing with someone who had simply erred. They were confronting a man who had weaponized information against his own relatives. These files were a form of blackmail, maintained for decades, a silent warning that Andrew would not go quietly if deemed too much of a liability. Intelligence services reviewing the materials also flagged additional concerns. Some of Andrew's contacts had ties to foreign intelligence. There were signs he had been cultivated, knowingly or unknowingly, by individuals aiming to exploit his position for espionage purposes. While there was no evidence he had directly betrayed state secrets, the potential for compromise was undeniable. His recklessness went far beyond personal scandal and touched upon matters of national security. As these details emerged, public opinion hardened. Whatever sympathy Andrew had retained after the Giuffre settlement evaporated. The files revealed not a man who had made errors of judgment, but someone who spent decades operating in ethical shadows, leveraging royal status to enrich himself and conceal behavior that would have destroyed ordinary citizens' lives. The gap between Andrew's public image and private reality was too wide to bridge. Within Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle, the family reckoning intensified. These were not formal meetings, but tense corridors, whispered arguments in private rooms, debates over loyalty, duty, and the survival of the institution. The monarchy, so skilled at projecting unity, found itself splintered by anger, fear, and competing ideas of obligation. King Charles was caught between blood and duty. As monarch, his responsibilities transcended personal feeling. The crown was an institution that had endured 1,000 years by adapting to threats and scandals. Yet Charles was also a brother who remembered Andrew as a mischievous boy at Balmoral, a promising naval officer, a son their late mother had defended. He could not erase those memories simply because the world demanded punishment. His private conversations with Prince William grew tense. William, conscious that he would one day inherit the throne along with the burden of restoring trust, argued that sentiment could no longer dictate policy. The monarchy's survival depended on proving that no royal stood above consequence, that the crown's authority required full accountability. Andrew had to face justice. But Charles, haunted by his own public vilification during the years of his divorce from Diana, hesitated. He understood exile, the silence, the humiliation, and could not bring himself to condemn his brother utterly. Princess Anne's stance was colder. Decades of dutiful service had left her impatient with indulgence. She had carried hundreds of engagements each year, while Andrew basked in privilege for her. The villa revelations were not shocking. They confirmed what she had always known, that Andrew believed himself untouchable. He's always thought the rules were for other people. She reportedly remarked her fury was not only moral, but practical. His disgrace had tainted the institution. She had spent her life preserving the Queen Consort. Camilla added a quieter but firm perspective. She knew the cruelty of the press, the sting of being cast as a villain, yet she recognized the line between personal missteps and moral collapse. What the files revealed went beyond error into exploitation. She supported her husband, but urged him privately to make decisive choices before public anger consumed them all. Prince Edward and Sophie, the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh, observed the turmoil with quiet dread. They had built lives defined by diligence rather than drama, yet the scandal threatened to engulf everyone. Reporters now questioned what the family had known, and when Edward, once close to Andrew, felt a dull grief, his brother had become a stranger, the next generation could not escape its pull across the Atlantic. Prince Harry watched from California with conflicted emotions. The headline seemed to echo every criticism he had ever made of the institution's misplaced loyalties. They protect the wrong people, he had said, and now, before the world's eyes, that belief appeared justified, yet satisfaction eluded him. Andrew was still family, a flawed, fallen uncle. The scandal confirmed that the dysfunction he had fled was not imagined. It was embedded for Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie. The ordeal was devastating. They adored their father and had defended him publicly, even as his reputation collapsed. But the Villa files made defense impossible. The evidence was overwhelming. They faced a cruel choice: stand by him and risk their own credibility, or distance themselves and be accused of betrayal behind palace walls. They begged him to cooperate, to show contrition to end the fight. He refused, insisting he had been wronged. Their love turned to exhaustion. Inside the palace, tempers flared. Court ears accustomed to restraint now heard raised voices behind closed doors. In one confrontation, Charles, pushed to the edge by William's demand for absolute transparency, shouted that destroying Andrew would not cure the monarchy's deeper sickness. William countered that sparing him would doom it. The divide between father and son, once theoretical, became generational, one clinging to mercy, the other to survival. Outside, the pressure intensified. Each new revelation from the Villa files unleashed another wave of outrage. Parliamentary committees demanded inquiries into royal finances. Protesters gathered outside palace gates with signs reading, "Accountability for all." The scandal had expanded beyond Andrew to the system that had shielded him. How had he maintained offshore accounts unnoticed? Who had approved his dealings? How many others operated in similar shadows? The monarchy had weathered storms before: abdication, divorces, deaths, but this one felt different. The Epstein link had been about judgment, the Jouffre settlement about morality. The vilifications were structural, exposing an ecosystem of privilege where oversight was optional and consequence negotiable. It was no longer about one man's disgrace, but an institution's failure to enforce its own rules. Public patience thinned. Commentators who once defended the monarchy now questioned its relevance. Polls showed falling support among younger Britons. Even traditionally loyal newspapers began calling for reform fit for a modern democracy within the palace. Senior courtiers whispered of transparency, audits, reduced expenses, and permanent downsizing of the working royals. Charles understood that the crisis had forced an irreversible shift. The old mystique built on silence and distance no longer protected them. If the monarchy was to survive, it would have to surrender the illusion of infallibility. For centuries, the family had treated scandal as something to be buried. Now, concealment itself was the scandal. William emerged as the advocate of reform, arguing that the future of the crown depended on authenticity, not perfection. Anne backed him, pragmatic as ever. Camilla, though sympathetic to her husband's hesitation, conceded privately that William was right, and Charles, weary from the weight of both throne and conscience, began to accept what he had resisted from the start: that protecting Andrew meant endangering everything else in time. Official statements were issued, carefully worded acknowledgements of wrongdoing without explicit condemnation behind their restrained language. The message was unmistakable. The era of automatic forgiveness had ended. Andrew was to live quietly, indefinitely, without title or public role. Within those ancient walls, something fundamental shifted. The monarchy, once the embodiment of continuity, found itself forced to change or perish. The Villa files had not only destroyed a prince, they had exposed a truth long whispered but rarely admitted: that the greatest threat to the crown had never been its enemies, but the failings of those within it, fallout from the unravelling of a prince. By summer, the immediate crisis had hardened into something slower and more punishing: a grinding process of legal proceedings, negotiations, and incremental disclosures that refused to fade from the headlines. What had begun as a scandal now evolved into a reckoning. Prince Andrew had been formally stripped of all remaining patronages and military appointments, a process that had begun after the Joffre resettlement, but was now completed with an unmistakable sense of finality. His office at Buckingham Palace was shuttered, his long-time staff dismissed, official stationery destroyed. He was no longer permitted to use the style His Royal Highness in any capacity. The title of Duke of York remained technically, but it existed only as a courtesy, not as a reflection of any working royal status. The villa itself became the epicenter of a transnational legal storm. Swiss authorities, coordinating with British financial investigators, pored over the files recovered from the property. Thousands of documents revealed a maze of offshore transfers, shell companies, and discreet intermediaries. Several accounts were frozen, pending investigation, their holders summoned for questioning. Lawyers spoke in cautious tones about complex structures, but the implication was clear. A network built to obscure accountability was finally being untangled. Forensic accountants traced money flows that linked old acquaintances, former aides, and business associates who had long operated in the grey zone surrounding royal privilege. The aftermath meant navigating a transformed landscape. The old equilibrium, where discretion shielded misjudgments, had shattered. In his first major address to Parliament as sovereign, King Charles spoke of renewal through transparency, a phrase that every journalist immediately recognised as an oblique reference to his disgraced brother. He announced a suite of reforms: independent audits of royal finances, stricter rules on outside business interests, and clearer lines separating personal wealth from public duty. These measures, once considered too radical, now appeared indispensable to the survival of the monarchy itself. Public scrutiny turned fierce. The Crown Estate and the sovereign grant, through which royal funding was distributed, came under unprecedented parliamentary review. Committees demanded line-by-line accounting: who was paid, what for, and under whose authority. The discovery of the villa's hidden transactions ignited a broader debate about whether taxpayers should continue financing an institution that had so often blurred the boundary between service and self-interest. Newspapers published exposés on royal spending. Television panels debated abolition. The monarchy, though not in immediate danger, was undeniably changed. Meanwhile, Prince Andrew withdrew into near seclusion. Royal Lodge, the mansion he had fought to retain despite mounting pressure, became a gilded confinement. He ventured out rarely, usually for solitary rides through Windsor Great Park or short trips to church. Under discreet escort, each outing risked being photographed in an unflattering image that would reappear in tabloids as proof of his humiliation. Old friends, once eager for proximity to power, quietly disengaged. His phone, once buzzing with invitations, now stayed mostly silent within palace circles. His name was spoken in lowered tones, a reminder of how swiftly a prince could become a pariah. His daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, remained dutiful but distant. They visited regularly, bringing their children, attempting to preserve a semblance of family connection. Yet beneath the polite conversations lay exhaustion and quiet resentment. Both women were carving independent lives far removed from their father's shadow. Their careers, charitable work, and marriages all depended on a fragile separation from his scandals. Each time their names resurfaced, progress threatened to unravel. Love endured, but it was burdened by disappointment and the silent fear that proximity might once again cost them their peace. The legal process, meanwhile, crept forward with the glacial precision of international law. Prosecutors in Switzerland, Britain, and the United States examined whether the financial records supported criminal charges. The Duke retained a phalanx of lawyers, seasoned specialists in white-collar defence and reputation management. Yet, even the most skilled legal minds could not erase what the documents exposed: a pattern of influence, entitlement, and questionable associations that no court ruling could fully absolve. Diplomatic ripples followed. Republican movements in Australia, Canada, and the Caribbean seized upon the scandal as evidence that the monarchy was an outdated relic, unfit for modern democracy. Editors called for referendums on constitutions without crowns, allied governments, particularly those whose officials had once met Andrew during his tenure as a trade envoy, voiced discomfort. They asked privately what promises or introductions he had made, and whether those dealings had blurred lines between public duty and personal gain in Washington. American authorities reopened aspects of the Epstein investigation, citing fresh material from the Villa archives. The FBI requested access to correspondence detailing the Duke's visits to Epstein's properties and his communications with known associates. The British government, anxious to preserve intelligence cooperation with its most vital ally, entered delicate negotiations. The outcome was a set of carefully worded agreements that satisfied neither side completely, but prevented a diplomatic fracture. As months stretched into a year, public outrage gave way to a colder, quieter acceptance. Prince Andrew's reputation was beyond salvage. He had become, as one commentator wrote, a ghost of privilege wandering through the ruins of his own, making the royal family endure. But its veneer of moral authority was chipped and scarred. Inside the palace, courtiers spoke of lessons learned, though privately they feared what other secrets might still lie buried in properties or accounts yet unexamined. King Charles often reflected in solitude on what the crisis had revealed. He had long known his brother's weaknesses, impulsiveness, vanity, a fatal trust in the wrong people, but he had underestimated their cost. The Villa files had forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth, that the family's instinct to protect its own had in practice protected misconduct. The revelation was not only about Andrew's guilt, but about the monarchy's collective blindness, the culture of silence that had enabled him for so long. The monarchy, as ever, would endure. It had weathered abdication, war, divorce, and death, but this time endurance required transformation. The new reign would be defined less by mystique than by accountability. The gilded certainties of an earlier era were gone, replaced by the austere knowledge that public trust, once lost, could only be rebuilt slowly and painfully. And so the villa in Verbier, once a retreat of opulence and secrecy, became something far more symbolic. A monument to the perils of unchecked privilege. In its shuttered windows and emptied rooms lay the lesson that no title, however ancient, could shield its bearer from consequence forever. The scandal had begun as one man's disgrace. It ended as a mirror held up to an entire institution. What began as a routine property inspection ended with revelations that shook the British monarchy to its foundations. The villa's secrets forced a reckoning with uncomfortable truths about privilege, accountability, and the lengths to which one member of the royal family would go to protect himself, even from his own relatives. Subscribe for more untold stories from inside the palace walls, and don't forget to like, share, and comment to join the conversation on royal secrets.